What happens when you let one AI talk to another AI? This is an interesting example that comes courtesy of OpenAI, which has a series of scripts showing you how their agents can interact with each other to accomplish more complex tasks. This is a pretty simple one in which we've got a story outline generator AI that will write a short story outline and then send it to a critic. And the critic takes a look at it and decides whether it's good enough or not. And if it's not good enough, it will send feedback back to the story outline generator, who will produce a new draft. The new draft goes back to the critic, and so on and so forth until the critic decides that the story is good enough for a pass. So I ran the script on my own machine, and frankly, the first run was a little bit boring. I told it I wanted a story about romance, but the only printouts you get from the script by default are sort of time markers of what's happening. So you can see a story outline is being generated and the evaluator says it needs improvement. So it runs with feedback, a new story outline is generated, but you can't actually see what's going on. And also it looked like the process was going to continue forever. I guess that the critic was very hard to satisfy. The prompt for the critic does specify that it should never give the story a pass on the first try. But after about 10 back and forths, I was getting a little bit bored, so I decided to modify the script. And the first mod was, I want to see what's going on. So I used Codex, which is OpenAI's code editing tool, and is a really great tool for sloppy coders or people who don't want to bother reading the API docs for something. I wouldn't recommend using it on a more complex project, but for something like this, it was a great way to make a quick mod. So I told it I wanted to print out what happens after each story outline is generated and after each critique, so I can see how the stories are being modified gradually in response to the feedback and what the feedback actually is. So I made the mods and reran it with the same prompt, which is that I wanted a short story outline about romance. And now we can see what's coming out. And frankly, it's a little bit more than I care to read. So I quit that out and made another mod saying that instead of a short story outline, I wanted just a short story, a very short story, one that would only be one paragraph long. And I also modified the prompt for the evaluator or critic, saying that I wanted it to be concise and only give me 1 or 2 lines of feedback. Now, at least this version works. It doesn't work super great. I noticed immediately that the critic produces the same feedback over and over again, even if the writer is obviously trying to incorporate that feedback. Basically, it keeps asking for more and more complexity, and the first 2 feedbacks are exactly the same word for word. And so we end up with a kind of silly situation where the writer is trying to fit way too much complexity into what is just a 1-paragraph story. But here's the first version and then the final version. So the first version of the 1-paragraph story goes like this. In the timeless glow of the old library, Cassie and Ethan found themselves drawn together by whispers of history and echoes of aged wood. They often crossed paths between towering shelves, each secretly lingering in hopes of catching the other's eye. One rainy afternoon, as soft thunder laced the air, they reached for the same dusty novel. Their eyes met, and a gentle warmth surged through them like the promise of spring. Emboldened, Ethan whispered, "Do you believe in stories coming to life?" Cassie smiled, her cheeks flushed like the roses in a forgotten garden. "With the right co-author," she replied, their fingers entwining over worn pages, 2 hearts writing the tale of love in the whispers of rain. So the evaluator said that needed improvement, and over again it asked for more complexity and backstory and stuff like that. And what we ended up with, the final story, goes like this. In the timeless glow of the old library, Cassie and Ethan found themselves drawn together by whispers of history and the echoes of aged wood. They often crossed paths between towering shelves, each secretly lingering in hopes of catching the other's eye. So far the same. An unexpected challenge loomed. Cassie received a coveted offer to study art history abroad, fulfilling her lifelong ambition, while Ethan faced the responsibility of caring for his ailing father, tethering him to the town. One rainy afternoon, as soft thunder laced the air, they reached for the same dusty novel. Their eyes met, and a gentle warmth surged through them like the promise of spring. "Do you believe in stories coming to life?" Ethan asked, hope and uncertainty mingling in his voice. Cassie's heart was torn between 2 worlds. With the right co-author, she replied, knowing the decision would test their bond. Fingers entwined over worn pages, they faced the storm of choices ahead, each wondering if love could withstand the whispers of rain and the pull of separate dreams. So obviously, based on the pretty strict feedback and extremely repetitive feedback from the critic, the story writer is trying to fit a little bit too much into this short story, but it's an interesting result anyway. My next thought was I would try to specify what agents, or rather what GPT models, the system was using. Using the Model 4.0, the results are markedly different. For one thing, the critic was never satisfied, and so I got tired after this went through 10 or so iterations. It kept asking it to introduce more and more complexity, and the writer complied to the extent that it forgot the instruction that it was supposed to keep things to just one paragraph. It's still an extremely short story. There are not that many more words overall. I'm not going to read the first version, but you can find it on the screen if you want to pause and look at that. The last version goes like this. In the bustling city, Lily's vintage bookshop faced closure due to rising rents. Once a promising pianist, she had transformed the shops back into a musical sanctuary. One evening, amid swirling autumn leaves, she met Oliver, an amateur astronomer skilled in historical cartography, struggling with a celestial map. His eyes, alive with possibility, met hers as she offered a hand. To save the bookstore, they planned starry melodies, blending Lily's music with Oliver's star projections. On the event day, a power outage threatened disaster. Drawing on his expertise, Oliver ingeniously constructed a makeshift planetarium using mirrors and candlelight, creating a breathtaking display of constellations across the walls. As Oliver illuminated the space, Lily adapted her performance, guiding the audience on a musical journey under the recreated stars, encouraging them to envision constellations through her evocative notes. The synchronization of their talents created an unforgettable, intimate experience. Impressed by their creativity and resilience, several influential guests came forward with significant financial pledges, captivated by the enchanting atmosphere and determined to support the bookstore's survival. Their unique skills not only resolved the crisis, but were instrumental in transforming a night into a pivotal success. As the evening concluded amidst enthusiastic applause, Lily and Oliver clasped hands, their shared ingenuity and triumph promising a future filled with collaborative wonders, a light shining even brighter than the city around them. So this is a really garbage story, obviously. And I think what's happened here is at the beginning, there were the basic characters still of Lily and Oliver, and the critic said, just like keep adding on more stuff, more character development, more character background, more complexity, problems to overcome, and without considering the limitations of the space. And so we ended up with something that was a little bit on the silly side and not very good, but it's possible that a middle schooler would have, or maybe a high schooler would have written a story like this. Certainly pretty bad, but nonetheless interesting and very distinctly different from the first version we had using whatever the default model was in this environment. For comparison, I then decided to change the model to O3, which is in theory one of the latest advanced reasoning models. I also found that I had to re-add the instruction not to accept the first version just to force at least one revision. And we got a completely different style of story out of this. So a little bit shorter. The original version of the story is as follows. On a cool autumn evening beneath twinkling city lights, Mia and Liam found each other on a quiet park bench, their hearts stirred by an unexpected meeting. An accidental smile sparked a conversation that mingled memories and dreams as the gentle hum of distant street music worked its tender magic. In that shared moment, every breath felt like a secret promise, a delicate beginning to a timeless romance where the simple act of being together turned ordinary surroundings into a canvas of hope and possibility. The critic said, "Your narrative is beautifully written, but it's too smooth. Please incorporate a hint of internal tension or conflict to add depth to this romance." And then it accepted the next version of the story, which is basically the same, just a little bit more about lingering scars and some hope going along. The interesting thing is that this is actually it's not as trite and awful a story. Somehow it doesn't try to squeeze as much into a very short space. So it's actually more evocative. And for whatever reason, the O3 model seems to do a better job of writing than the 4.0. Finally, I decided to compare this to another GPT model, O1, which is a coding specific model, but it's supposed to spend longer thinking. And the results were actually really good. This produced the best story by far. It didn't bother giving the characters names, realizing that in one paragraph it doesn't really matter that much. And it paints a more evocative picture than the first model that we looked at, while also making more things actually happen than the second model. So the story that it ended up with after a couple of back and forths with the critic was this. She tried not to lose herself in his gaze, busying her restless hands with a paperback novel on her lap. He stayed silent, feeling the unspoken gravity that clung to every brush of their arms in the crowded subway carriage. Their eyes met, held, then darted away, each aware of a gentle knot of tension that neither was bold enough to untangle. Every screech of the train against the tracks seemed to echo that restless hope, illuminating in its brief shaking stops the possibility of something promising and unnamed between them. By the time they reached the last station, the moment to speak hung heavy in the fluorescent light, like a risk too fragile to take. But as they finally rose to exit, a shy half smile from her and his lingering return glance held the promise of more than just another dull commute, a quiet promise of what might be if either of them dared. So that's actually a much better story. And as a result of our choosing the right model and balancing both the writer and the critic, we've come up with something that's not entirely terrible to read, which is kind of interesting. So I had to give it one bonus prompt, and I asked it to write a story that could have been an episode of The Office. After a few rounds of revisions, this is what it came up with. On a random Tuesday, Michael converted the break room into a Zen den, insisting everyone gather for hourly breath circles. Dwight, armed with a clipboard, patrolled for inauthentic exhalations. Jim kept swapping the soft flute music with a looping squeaky toy track, driving Dwight into a stifled rage. Angela guarded a fresh white rug she'd picked out for extra purity, while Pam scrambled to reset the ambiance with ocean waves. Stanley, utterly unfazed, dozed beneath a half-dead fern. Then Michael introduced his pièce de résistance, a thunderous gong he'd pound every time someone looked the least bit stressed, ensuring, of course, that absolutely nobody could relax. So that's pretty funny, and is a good basic idea for an Office A-plot. If you look at the earlier versions of the story, is it improved? Probably not. It's different. The AI took out some of the funny things from earlier and substituted other ones. It didn't really make meaningful progress. So I don't know how well the AIs actually work with each other, but they do work with each other. They've had a conversation, and that's interesting in itself. I'm going to post a link in the description to the code base from OpenAI so you can take a look at this and other examples if you want to play around with it, and stay tuned for further AI experiments.